Hi, I'm Captain Bill Tody, retired U.S. Navy, former CEO of Spartan Corporation. Now, I've been doing a series of podcasts advertising the release of my book, From CO to CEO, A Practical Guide for Transitioning from Military to Industry Leadership. I've gotten some feedback from some folks who knew I had a background in Ukraine, asking me for my opinion on what's happening over there with Russia, the Russia-Ukraine situation. I hesitated to do this because the details are complex, and yet the cause is unerringly simple. The simple cause is that Putin is evil. He has evil hegemonistic designs, and his invasion of Ukraine is not unlike Hitler's invasion of Poland. That's why we have to do something about it. If you want to understand the complex nuances, you can continue watching this podcast. Now, the opinion I present in this podcast is not just based on my own experience in Ukraine, and I do have experience there, but also an American friend who lives and works in Ukraine and is still there as I write this. Now, I've been in contact with him. I'm going to call him Jethro. Later, I'll talk about Jethro Helps Ukraine. Obviously, that's not his real name because I want to protect his identity as an American in Ukraine, assisting. He's been working there for years, but he stayed even after the attack began because he's trying to help. And he's on the ground now, and I received an update from him just a few days ago to make sure I understand how things are transpiring. If you want to skip to the part of the video where I tell you how you can help, you can refer to my channel markers below. This is a long video because there's a lot to cover to understand this problem, and I hope to give you a fuller picture of why we're here. So the How You Can Help section is near the end, and look at the channel marker to find it. And why should you listen to me? Because in my civilian career, I had business trying to improve the security of Ukraine and a few other former Soviet states. So I had employees in Ukraine and the other Soviet countries, and visited them several times during the course of my contracts there. Even meeting with then President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and more on that later. I always find it's useful to start with a map. So here's a map of Europe. The former Soviet Union included the countries that I'm going to point to here as separate states, starting in the north with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There's this little island state called Kaliningrad. Talk about that in a moment. Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and over to the east here, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Now, further to the east, you've got Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and states like that. They're off the map. I'm not going to cover them because they're not germane to this conversation. Now, all of these states, except for Kaliningrad, here in the pink, are independent. Kaliningrad is still part of Russia. So you've got this little island of Russia in between Poland and Lithuania that's the home of Russia's Baltic Fleet. These other states are independent. And of course, in 2014, Russia re-assimilated, I'll call it that, the Crimea, and I'll talk about that later. But these states, since they gained their independence from the Soviet Union, all have had a desire to align with the European Union as a minimum, and in some cases, NATO as well. And I'll talk about NATO as it pertains to Georgia and Ukraine. You're going to say, now what about Poland? Wasn't Poland part of the Soviet Union? No, there were other states that were considered Eastern Bloc satellite states that included Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany. Technically, they weren't part of the Soviet Union. They weren't Soviet socialist republics, but they were clearly under the Soviet influence. Albania is another one that I can, off the top of my head. When some of these countries said, hey, look, we think we want to be aligned in NATO to protect ourselves from Russia, from the beginning, Putin declared that doing so he saw as a threat to the security of Russia. Now, how that's possible it's impossible to say because clearly none of these states were going to attack Russia, nor has NATO indicated any desire to attack Russia. But it's just an excuse. Because as some of you may know, Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia in August 2008. And I have some background with that as well. Now, one of Georgia's primary aims in the post-Soviet era was to join NATO. They knew that Russia was something to be feared, and they believed that their only hope was to become a member of NATO and be protected by Article 5 of NATO. And on our part, the American President, George W. Bush, supported both Republic of Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO. That invasion of Georgia, the invasion formally, only lasted 17 days. Putin declared that his goals had been met with the invasion on August 17th, and Russia would begin the withdrawal from Georgia on the condition that Russia would be allowed to retain what Putin declared as militarized border guard bases within the Republic of Georgia borders. What can we learn from the Georgia event that might help us understand what happened in Ukraine? Russia invaded Georgia despite our presence there. That's an important thing to remember. The presence of Americans in the Republic of Georgia, and in fact, Americans assisting with the security of the Republic of Georgia, did not impede in any way Putin's decision to invade. In fact, in 2008, our employees, retired Army planners and things like that, their approach was, send me in, coach. Let me help these Georgians defend against Russia. And of course, the American policy was stand down. Do not get involved. We didn't leave, but our charter was to stay safe and stay uninvolved. And we kept people there throughout the invasion in 2008. It's also important to highlight some of Ukraine's history. Now, this is a very high-level summary. I'm sure some people are going to be able to find fault with what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try to get at least the major points correct. Now, the Ukrainian fight for independence goes back centuries, but the most notable 20th century event occurred in 1917 with the Ukrainian War of Independence against the Tsar at Tsarist Russia. So it actually predates the Russian Revolution of the Bolsheviks. And that led to the establishment of the Ukrainian People's Republic. And this is a key point because later I'm going to point out how Putin subverts this history with his statements on Ukraine. Now, after the Soviet Union was formed in 1922, the Ukrainian Republic was incorporated into the USSR as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But the anchor in Ukrainian consciousness of their relationship with Russia has to be the terror famine, that's what it's called, terror famine episode of Holodomor from 1932 to 1933. Now, as background, Ukraine was one of the largest grain-producing republics in the USSR. During this time, a famine occurred in Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, the causes of the famine are in dispute, whether it was man-made intentional policy to reduce food production to cause the famine, or whether it was simple, incompetence. It could be either. What's not under dispute is that Soviet policies on food distribution contributed to it, resulting in the death of as many as 7 million Ukrainians who died in Holodomor. So it's central in their historical consciousness of Ukrainian interactions with Soviet Russia. To understand the dynamic in Ukraine, we have to understand how things played out in 3 separate regions. A series of protests or revolutions in Kyiv, what was happening in the eastern regions of Ukraine, mostly in an area called Donbass, and what was happening in the Crimea Peninsula. Let's start with Kyiv. Now, the first anti-Russian or anti-Soviet protest, or borderline revolution for that matter, occurred in 1990. This was called the Revolution of Granite and was the first of 3 revolutions to occur on what would be referred to as the Maidan. Maidan word just means square inside Kyiv. The objective of this protest on the Maidan was more autonomy from Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian communist leaders. So when the Soviet Union disbanded in 1991, Ukraine immediately declared its independence. Now, at that time, there was still a substantial amount of Soviet nuclear weapons and strategic bombers located in Ukraine that worried many global powers. Folks worried what would become of these nuclear weapons. Would they end up in terrorist hands, things like that. So in order to get control of all of the nuclear weapons outside of Russia, to include some that were in Kazakhstan, for example, a series of cooperative threat reduction agreements, it was created by the United States, where the United States would pay for threat reduction initiatives in all the former Soviet Union states, and some even in Russia. And I was involved in one that involved demilitarizing of Russian former Soviet SS-17 ICBMs. But we also demilled strategic bombers in Ukraine. And in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons and strategic bombers by the means of a document called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. Now, the signatories on this Budapest Memorandum were Russia, Ukraine, of course, the United States, and for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, in return, the Clinton administration agreed to provide an assurance to Ukraine against threats or use of force in their against their territorial integrity. So one of my contracts was to enhance the security, the border security of the state of Ukraine, inside Ukraine. And in that contract, I had both retired American military as well as Ukrainian employees in Kyiv and throughout the country. Now, that agreement to provide security to Ukrainians' borders was apparently forgotten by the Obama administration when Russia began its incursion into Crimea and, of course, the eastern provinces of Ukraine in 2014. So it's interesting to remember that without that security assurance in the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine would have been unlikely to give up its nuclear weapons. And so that was in 1994. How would they be happening now? If Ukraine still had its nuclear weapons, would Russia have invaded? You can envision 2 scenarios, one better, one worse. One better where Russia says, we're not going to take a chance while Ukraine has nuclear weapons. One worse where Russia invades anyway, and Ukraine defends themselves with nuclear weapons, and we end up with a nuclear exchange between Ukraine and Russia that could get ugly very quickly. In any case, I'm pretty sure history would be different. The next major demonstration occurred in 2004 in the very same square, or Maidan, and was precipitated by what most citizens believed to be a fraudulent presidential election, when a pro-Russia candidate who is a convicted murderer and aligned to Russian mafia was declared the winner and the president of Ukraine, despite widespread support by the population towards his opponent. It was believed that Russia was behind the election fraud in Ukraine that resulted in this criminal winning the election. That resulted in thousands of Ukrainians protesting nationwide, with the center core being on the Maidan in Kyiv, which resulted in the results of the election being annulled and the pro-Europe candidate being elected as president of Ukraine. And that was in 2004-2005 time frame. But 2010, new elections, what happens? the pendulum swings back, and that very same pro-Russian crook of a president was elected, who essentially annulled all of the pro-EU measures that his predecessor put into place. This guy who was somehow elected president of Ukraine, it's unclear to what extent Russia was behind that election in 2010. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So, in 2014, again focused on the very same Maidan or square in Kyiv, another round of protests that turned violent took place. This series being referred to as the Euromaidan or Eurosquare protests. But again, you've got this pro-Russian president in place. He reacted very vigorously and violently and directed the police to put down the protest with violence, resulting in, I think, 108 Ukrainians killed, protesters killed, and 13 police officers killed. And here's some of the videos of those clashes. And as you could see with these videos, it resulted in a very negative reaction to that president's strong-arm tactics. The Ukrainian parliament therefore voted to remove the president from office and issued a warrant for his arrest for ordering the mass killing of civilians, whereupon he fled the country and now lives in exile in Russia. No surprise there. Now on to eastern Ukraine and Donbass. There were regions in the east of Ukraine that had a majority Russian population. And to understand that, you've got to go back to the days of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet days, the Soviet leaders encouraged widespread migration from one Soviet republic to another. Hey, Stalin was Georgian. He wasn't Russian, right? And there was a lot of migration between Georgia and Russia, Russia and Georgia, Ukraine and Russia, Russia and Ukraine. So there's regions in eastern Ukraine, region of Donbass, primarily, that were largely ethnic Russian. And those folks said, look, we don't want to be Ukrainian. Some of those folks, not all of them. We want to continue to be Russian. Now, Putin played into this. Putin created a false narrative that said, hey, the country of Ukraine never actually existed as an independent state. It was an invention of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, I think 1922. And in fact, he declared that any Ukrainian who wanted to be Russian, you were going to be allowed to be part of the greater state of Russia. And he started issuing Russian passports to any Ukrainian citizen who wanted to be a Russian citizen. So all of this is happening. Folks in Donbass and eastern Ukraine declare they want to be Russian. They start protesting. But of course, that entire Putin narrative is a lie. It's a fantasy. It's a creation. Because Ukraine actually predates the Soviet Union. The Ukraine Revolution occurred when the Tsar led Russia a few years before the Bolshevik Revolution of the Soviet state. So Ukraine was independent before the Soviet Union existed. And finally, let's talk about Crimea. Back in the Soviet days, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was based on the Crimea Peninsula. Now, keep that in mind. When Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union, a state that no longer existed in 1991, the Russians had their Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. They did not have a suitable port to base that fleet in. However, the Russians, seemingly wanting to do the right thing, declared a policy that they would find a place to base their fleet outside of Ukraine, prior to the year 2017. Now, they made this declaration, I think, in 2005. So there was plenty of time for Russia to build a base to relocate its fleet. However, Russia didn't have any real deep sea ports on the Black Sea. So they would have to create one by dredging, by kind of doing the reverse of what China is doing in the South China Sea, where China is inventing islands where they didn't previously exist and declaring it Chinese territory. Russia would have had to invent a deep sea port to relocate its Black Sea fleet. Now, no surprise that that would cost a lot of money. And over time, the Russians kept defunding these projects to build this deep water port. And it became apparent by 2014 that that wouldn't happen, that the Russians were not going to make their 2017 deadline. Now, Ukraine, in turn, realizing the Russians weren't going to make the 2017 deadline, weren't crazy. I mean, they knew how much power Russia could bring to bear. So they said, you know what, Russia, we're going to give you relief on this 2017 deadline. We're going to give you more time to figure out where to locate your Black Sea fleet. Well, Putin took that out of their hands in 2014 by declaring that he was annexing Crimea into Russia, which solved the problem of where to base the Black Sea fleet. Right? They would remain in Crimea because now Crimea would be part of Russia. Now the international community, of course, condemned the action of Russia annexing Crimea. And throughout all this time, American companies like mine were funded by our government to improve the security of former republics. I would sometimes visit members of our Congress to reinforce the message of how important the Ukrainian initiative actually was, as well as congressional staffers who were interested in the program because, in particular, again, the narrative that Russia was putting out about Ukrainian corruption was playing strongly in the United States. And there were some members of Congress who were worried, probably correctly, about some of the money that the United States government was using to fund my program going into Ukrainian politicians' pockets. And all I could tell them is we were executing the program as well as we could, providing oversight on where the money went to the best of our ability. And, as bad as Ukrainian corruption isn't Russian border threats, the occupation of Donbass and Crimea, isn't that worse? And I was surprised by some of the answers I got from members of Congress. In some cases, it did not appear that they believed that the Russian threat was worse than potential Ukrainian corruption. And I got some pretty vigorous pushback. I was invited to meet with President Poroshenko during his visit to D.C. in, I think, May of 2016. And that conversation, my conversations with U.S. Congress, and their concern about Russian corruption, and the possibility that that concern might result in termination of our program to enhance Ukrainian security. That was the only thing we really talked about during my visit with President Poroshenko. And his response is burned in my memory. He said, Putin has a gun to my head. And I wish I had time. I wish I had more time to concern myself with Ukrainian government corruption. I'm trying to do what I can as it pertains to corruption, but there's a limit to what I can do under the threat of Russian invasion. Border security is more important to me. That was it. That was kind of the end of the conversation. I don't think it lasted 15 minutes. I think it was true that most Americans didn't consider the threat of Russian invasion of Ukraine real. On Ukrainians' part, I believe that their hope was that with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, American support of Ukrainian security would be strengthened. Now, this is not a political commentary, and I'm not going to make any political points on that issue and whether or not the Trump administration did, in fact, enhance Ukrainian security. So by the end of 2014, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president is ousted and living in exile in Russia. Russia has invaded eastern Ukraine purportedly to protect those ethnically Russian Ukrainian citizens from the Ukrainian government, and Russia has annexed Crimea, so they have a permanent place to base their Black Sea fleet. Why wasn't that enough for them? Why did they have to further invade Ukraine in 2022? To understand that, you have to understand a little more about Russia. And if you haven't been there, and I have, in summer and winter, don't want to go back in winter, I've had the odd experience of attending meetings in the Kremlin. I drank vodka with retired Soviet strategic rocket force generals, celebrating the fact that we never killed each other when they were manning their strategic rocket force bases, and I was XO on a Trident submarine. Climate in Russia is terrible. There aren't many natural ways to generate capital except for oil. Russia's population is declining at an accelerating rate. Russian life expectancy was short because of a very high level of alcoholism and a very poor healthcare system in Russia. Young people are leaving the country for cities, and others are leaving Russia behind entirely for a better life elsewhere. And the birth rate has plummeted. Babies are not being born. So the population is declining. Now, the Russian military is a conscript force, and when you only have people in the military for 2 or 3 years after they've been drafted, you don't have much time to train them properly before you have to send them out to their operational units, because you need them to spend time in the operational units before their enlistment ends. Now, in America's all-volunteer force, for example, it's not uncommon for military folks to train for as long as Russian military folks are in the military completely, right? So Americans will train for 18 months to 2 years before they reach their very first operational unit. In that amount of time, a Russian soldier's enlistment is already up, and he's out of the army. As a result, when American soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen reach their first operational unit, they are highly trained. Russian soldiers, when they reach their operational units, they've only had a modicum of training, and you can see that. It results in the current ineptness that you're seeing in Ukraine during the invasion right now. But there's a bigger problem here. The population of Russians in their 20s, their draftable age, is declining to the point where there soon won't be enough Russians in their 20s to draft, to build an army. If you want to learn more about this, see Peter Zeihan's excellent YouTube narrative. I recommend it, and I'm providing the link to it in the notes below. Now, this is one of the factors driving Putin's invasion timeline. If he's going to take Ukraine, he needs to do it before he runs out of those 20-somethings available to fight his war. And why has he been so willing to use these blitzkrieg tactics to destroy everything he sees and leave a wake of destruction, World War II style? Because he doesn't care about the population. He's not after the people. He's after the land. If all the Ukrainians run away to Poland or wherever, that's fine with him. He only needs to rebuild the country if people stay behind. If they run away, he can leave it in ashes. He wants the land, ostensibly, to defend against invasion. That's his stated excuse. And if that's the case, he only needs Ukraine to be a buffer between the West and Russia. He could put a bunch of military there and use it as kind of defense in depth, to use the military expression. Well, if that's true, he also needs Moldova. So after Ukraine, if he succeeds in Ukraine, he'll take some time to reconstitute his forces. We call that a strategic pause. Lick his wounds, rebuild. Then he goes after Moldova. Perhaps even a sliver of Romania, based on the map, to block all the potential passages towards Russia. And what about the Baltic states? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're a passage into Russia. They're a direct NATO passage into Russia. Except those three states are now part of NATO. So if he goes after them, that is a clash with NATO. So this can easily get worse before it gets better. So Putin sees Ukraine getting stronger with its repeated attempts to align to the West. And all the while, Russia is getting weaker. And look what has been happening to NATO. Since 1997, the following former Soviet republics or Eastern Bloc nations have joined NATO to protect themselves against Russia: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Albania, and Bulgaria. The only ones left are Ukraine, Georgia, and Russia's puppet state of Belarus, which is unlikely to try. If Russia is going to move to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, they must do it while they still have the population to support a military incursion. Putin believes that pulling Ukraine back into its fold is the first step in what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said is Putin's intention of rebuilding the Russian Empire. That's why he's moved on this now. And that's why Putin has to be stopped here. Now, a word on President Zelenskyy. Now, I know people probably thought of him as a lightweight when he was first elected because he was a comic actor, but Ronald Reagan was a comic actor for part of his career, and I think Gorbachev learned over the course of his tenure as the Soviet premier that Reagan was anything but a lightweight. Zelenskyy's family has an impressive background. His father is a professor of computer science. His mother is an engineer. He's a Jew whose great-grandfather was killed in the Holocaust. He lost 3 great-uncles as well. So he understands the danger of Europe failing to draw a line with respect to Nazi Germany. And so he sees the global view with respect to drawing a line now as it pertains to Russia. Zelenskyy has a law degree. Why did he enter the entertainment field? Because frankly, it pays better than being a lawyer in Ukraine. And it turns out he's pretty good at both. He's a native Russian speaker. I think that most people in Ukraine believed that he was pro-Russian while he was a candidate because he kept saying that if he's elected, he's going to negotiate with Putin to put an end to the conflict as it continued to exist in the east of Ukraine. I think Putin might have taken that as a sign of weakness, thinking that, well, he must be pro-Russian. If he was going to negotiate with me for peace, he'll absolutely negotiate if we invade. And in fact, the exact opposite happened. Every Ukrainian, even the ethnic Russian Ukrainians who constituted the majority of the population in the East, are now monolithically Ukrainian. If Putin has done anything, he has united Ukrainians of all ethnicities against Russia. And Zelenskyy is smart enough to understand that and take advantage of it in the current struggle. In my book, I say that if serendipity finds you, you've got to act. Serendipity finds you, you don't find it. Well, serendipity found President Zelenskyy, and he has behaved in a manner that would make any nation proud. Statesman, he's acted ethically and morally, and he's inspired not just Ukraine, but the world. And there have been a couple of pronouncements by the White House that are worth reflecting on. Let's first listen to this statement by White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, where she makes a point about no-fly zones.
And as we've said before, a no-fly zone would require implementation. It would require us potentially shooting down Russian planes, NATO shooting down Russian planes, and we are not interested in getting into World War III.
Now, the truth is, Jen is right on that point. If you're going to implement a no-fly zone, you have to be willing to shoot down Russian airplanes who enter it. That means NATO airplanes shooting down Russian airplanes. And that's, of course, an act of war. If you aren't willing to do this, then it becomes just like, remember President Obama's red line on Syria? Nobody took seriously, and it became meaningless. And a no-fly zone where we aren't shooting down Russian airplanes is meaningless. So now let's listen to a second statement by Jen.
But can you lay out for us why the administration sees MiGs as provocative and javelins and stingers as not provocative?
Well, first, javelins and stingers are defensive weapons. MiGs or planes are offensive weapons, which are a different type of military system. I would say the other assessment that we've done, not through the White House, not through the President, from the Department of Defense, is to assess what is effective and what works in terms of fighting this war on the ground. And that is...
Well, I'm afraid on that point, Jen is completely wrong. Some weapons can be purely defensive, like Patriot missiles. But most weapons can be used both offensively and defensively, including the rifles we seem to have no problem sending to Ukraine. If you shoot someone that's invading your home with a rifle or invading your country, then it's a defensive weapon. But if you enter somebody else's country, if you invade and shoot somebody with that rifle or rob a bank with that rifle, clearly it's an offensive weapon. Same with airplanes. Even bombers can be defensive weapons if you're bombing invading tanks. Fighters can be defensive if you shoot down invading aircraft. So to say that jets are offensive weapons, well, that's just plain stupid. And it's a failure to understand Tactics 101. If somebody in the Pentagon told her to say that, that person should be fired. Back in the Cold War, we talked about the domino effect, that once one state fell to communism, it would have a domino effect causing other states to fall to communism. That was the excuse we used for going into Vietnam. Vietnam probably was not a domino. Vietnam fell to communism, but there wasn't a huge expansion of communism beyond that. The domino effect probably didn't exist during the Cold War. Well, it exists now. Okay? Ukraine is a domino. This intervention was senseless. The Soviet Union may not exist anymore, but we cannot let this domino fall. If we get involved more aggressively, will this result in World War III? Let's make this one thing clear. A conventional war with Russia between the United States or NATO and Russia, that's not World War III. World War III is when countries around the globe are in conflict with each other. Having 15 countries fight Russia is not World War III, unless it goes nuclear. That might be World War III. If we were to fight Russia in Europe, most of the world would be unanimous in its opposition to Russia. The only allies Russia might have are China and North Korea. And in a conventional war in Europe against Russia, we would win that war. The only way this becomes World War III is if Putin uses nukes. And the only way that happens is if Putin is insane. And that's what he wants the world to believe, that he's insane. He wants the world to believe that he would use nukes. And we want to avoid the use of nukes at all costs, of course. Would he actually use them? Who knows? Maybe he is that insane. But that's why Western forces are treading lightly right now. Now, except for the Russian submarine force, I think we've learned over the past month and a half, Russia's military is feckless. And I know something about the Russian submarine force. They're real. But other than the submarine force, we could beat the Russian military, in my opinion, in a matter of a few months. So what about China? China was excited by this war at first because they thought it would show how weak the West is. Now they've had to wake up to the fact that their allies, all of them, are useless. Russia, North Korea, they're all useless. And so China's on their own in their conflict with the West. And they can't be happy with the way this has evolved. Well, China's too smart to get involved in a war in defense of Russia. But if the West is preoccupied with a battle with Russia in Europe, there is a chance that China takes advantage of that opportunity to seize the moment to take Taiwan. And if that happens, it's going to be important for the United States to take a strategic pause, as I said, and ask ourselves from the global strategic point of view, what is worse? Is it worse to allow Europe to deal with the Russia problem, our NATO allies, allowing the United States the freedom to deal with the China problem? Is it worse to have Ukraine annexed by Russia or Taiwan annexed by China? And to answer that question, it's important to consider that Russia is a basket case. Time is not on their side. With time, Russia only gets weaker. That's not the situation we find with China. With China, with time, they only get stronger. And therefore, they may be the more significant long-term threat. So if the war expands to a NATO war in Europe, and China takes the opportunity to try the annexation of Taiwan, the invasion of Taiwan, it's my opinion that the right thing to do would be for the United States to leave Russia to NATO, because if we've learned anything from the Ukrainian event, it's that the Russian military is inept and that NATO can likely handle them on their own, allowing us to deal with the China problem. But let's hope it doesn't get there. And so how do we stop it? At the national level, the United States needs to provide Ukraine with everything they need to bleed Russia dry in a war of attrition, until the people of Russia say enough, like they did in the 1980s in Afghanistan. As I said, if it doesn't stop here, there's no telling where it goes. Moldova, Romania, NATO is involved with either Romania or the Balkans, so it needs to stop here. It's the people of Russia who have to do something about this Putin problem. Also at the national level, we need to continue to do things to weaken Russia's economy, or at least stop doing things that strengthen it. For example, we should stop paying Russia to transport astronauts to the International Space Station at the price of $80 million per astronaut. Today, SpaceX can get that done from American soil, and we should let them. As well, Russia has generated a huge spike in oil prices caused by their invasion, which creates havoc in oil markets. They're now enjoying profits from that price increase. But they would not be profiting if only nations would stop buying oil from them. In the U.S., we need to source our energy here, and to the extent we can, help our allies with their energy needs. At the global level, we cannot allow Russia to continue to profit from these crimes. And that means our allies have to stop paying Russia as well. What can you all do to help? I hesitate to name charities because there are several good ones and way too many bad ones. But there is one charity, the AFYA Foundation, AFYA, and I'll put the link to their charity below in the notes below, that has established a Ukraine airlift disaster response hub. And they're supplying food and medical supplies to the people of Ukraine. The Charity Navigator seems to indicate it's a well-run charity, so maybe you can give to them. And of course, there's my friend in Ukraine, Jethro, who's doing what he can to help. Jethro helps, hashtag Jethro helps Ukraine, remember? If he passes to me any other needs for things that'll help in his mission, I'll share it with you as I get it. In any case, that's what I think. I hope I was able to provide a little bit of clarity, if not illumination, with this narrative. I hope you learned something. William Tody, out.